What do we really inherit from a vanished age? Its ruins, its inventions, or the stories we choose to tell about both? At the end of the Second World War, Europe was filled with broken rail lines, burnt laboratories, flooded tunnels, and crates of documents carried away under armed guard. Some discoveries were plain to see. A rocket, a wing-shaped aircraft, a submarine built for a world that had not yet arrived. Others lived in rumor, in testimony, in half-buried chambers, and vanished name. Together, they formed a troubling possibility that history did not simply end one chapter in 1945. It quietly absorbed it. The familiar story is orderly. A defeated regime, desperate and deluded, chased miracle weapons that arrived too late to matter. There is truth in that account. Many of these programs were chaotic, compromised, and entangled with brutality on a scale that resists language. They were born inside a machinery of war and oppression, and whatever brilliance they contained was stained by the system that demanded it. And yet the archive has its own stubborn afterlife. When the guns fell silent, the victors did not leave these ideas in the rubble. They gathered engineers, blueprints, prototypes, formulas. They dismantled factories and reopened notebooks. They classified what they found, repurposed what they could, and folded fragments of an enemy's future into the architecture of their own. So this is not a story about glorifying dark ambition. It is a story about the unsettling relationship between invention and morality, between genius and violence, between what humanity can imagine and what it should ever build. Some of the technologies ahead were real. Some were exaggerated. Some remain suspended between documented fact and lingering speculation. But all of them point toward the same uneasy question. When a civilization reaches for the future in the middle of catastrophe, what exactly does it create? Progress, illusion, or a shadow that survives long after the builders are gone? What if the first step into the future did not arrive with a roar, but with a whisper underground? Imagine a chamber cut deep into stone, far from cities, far from daylight, where the air tastes of dust, metal, and secrecy. Men move carefully around cables, hooks, cylinders, and instruments whose purpose is known only to a few. Somewhere in that darkness, a machine is said to have pulsed with a force no one could fully explain. Not a weapon in the ordinary sense. Not a tank, not a plane, not even a rocket. More like a question built from steel. This is where our story first descends, into the strange legend of a device later remembered as the Bell. Some accounts describe it as an experimental engine. Others treat it as wartime myth, a confusion of fear, rumor, and fragmented testimony. The records are incomplete, the witnesses are few, and yet the persistence of the story matters. It tells us something about the atmosphere of those final war years, when science was no longer only a tool of industry or medicine, but a desperate language of power. In that world, laboratories became extensions of ideology. Research was pushed beyond ethics, beyond caution, beyond ordinary human limits. The pursuit of breakthrough was no longer patient or humane. It was compressed by panic. What emerged from that pressure was not always usable technology. Sometimes it was only the outline of an obsession, a machine carrying more symbolism than proof. And still, even uncertain stories leave a residue. They remind us that history is not made only of confirmed facts, but also of the things people were willing to attempt when they believed collapse was near. Whether the Bell was a failed experiment, an exaggerated secret, or something stranger in between, it stands at the threshold of this larger journey. Because before the rockets, Before the jets, before the machines that undeniably changed the modern world, there was already a deeper temptation taking shape, the belief that if one could master nature itself, then even time, distance, and defeat might somehow yield. How do you recognize the future when it arrives wearing the shape of a missile? On a cold launch site, the ground trembles before the eye can understand why. A column of fire pushes against the earth, and for a few brief seconds, the machine seems almost alive, straining upward through smoke and noise toward a sky it was never meant to touch peacefully. The V-2 rocket was built as an instrument of war, but hidden inside its violence was a terrible kind of beginning. It was one of the first human-made objects to cross the boundary where air thins and space begins. For those who designed it, the rocket represented engineering triumph under impossible pressure. It solved problems of fuel, guidance, propulsion, and altitude that had challenged dreamers for decades. It proved that a machine could rise beyond the reach of traditional aircraft and fall on a target faster than warning systems could respond. In military terms, it was revolutionary. In human terms, it was devastating. Cities did not experience the V-2 as innovation. They experienced it as sudden impact, as buildings folding inward, as a sound that arrived after destruction had already taken place. This is the paradox at the heart of so much technological history. The same breakthrough that opens a path to exploration may first appear as an instrument of fear. The line between wonder and ruin is often drawn only later, by those who inherit the mechanism after the violence has passed. When the war ended, the rocket's meaning changed almost overnight. The weapon became a blueprint. The engineers became prizes. Nations that had fought to stop one another now rushed to secure designs, components, and expertise. Within a generation, the logic that once sent explosives across borders would send satellites overhead and human beings toward the moon. That transformation does not erase the suffering, it complicates it. The V-2 forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Progress does not always emerge from noble places. Sometimes it rises from wreckage, carrying with it both brilliance and blame. And the question it leaves behind is not simply what humanity can build, but whether we can ever separate a great achievement from the shadow of how it began. Can a machine outrun the age that created it? Picture a dark silhouette cutting across a pale sky, not with the lumbering strain of older bombers, but with a smooth, unsettling speed. Pilots who glimpsed the first operational jet fighters often struggled to describe them. They did not seem like refinements of existing aircraft. They looked like intrusions from another era, sleek and abrupt, as if aviation itself had decided to leap forward without waiting for history to catch up. The jet was one of the clearest examples of a wartime idea arriving before the world was ready to fully absorb it. Propeller aircraft had dominated the air with familiar rhythms, spinning blades, gradual climbs, the visible mechanics of motion. Jet propulsion changed that language. It replaced the old grammar of flight with something cleaner, faster, more abstract. Air was no longer merely parted. It was compressed, ignited, and hurled backward with extraordinary force, pushing the aircraft into a new relationship with speed. In the final years of the war, this shift carried enormous strategic promise. A faster fighter could intercept bombers, evade pursuit, and redefine what air superiority meant. But technology alone does not guarantee victory. Fuel shortages, fragile supply lines, inexperienced pilots, and the chaos of a collapsing state limited what these aircraft could achieve. The machine may have been ahead of its time, but the nation deploying it was running out of time altogether. And yet, the image remained. After the war, the world studied those designs carefully. Engineers in multiple countries drew lessons from wing shapes, engine placement, and the very logic of high-speed flight. Civil aviation, military doctrine, and the modern imagination of air travel would all be changed by this new form. What had appeared first, in the smoke of conflict, would eventually become part of ordinary life, carrying passengers over oceans in hours rather than days. That is what makes the jet so haunting as a symbol. It was not merely a weapon, it was a preview. It showed how quickly the future can emerge, even in the middle of collapse. And it leaves behind a quiet question. When a civilization invents something truly transformative under the pressure of destruction, does that invention belong to its moment or to everyone who comes after? What if the most powerful weapon is the one no one can see coming? Beneath the surface of the Atlantic, war often unfolded without spectacle. There were no grand front lines in the ordinary sense, only cold water, coded signals, and long stretches of silence broken by impact. In that hidden world, submarines had already become symbols of stealth and patience. But by the final years of the conflict, a new generation of undersea craft began to suggest something more unsettling. Vessels designed not merely to dive, but to remain submerged long enough to reshape naval warfare itself. The advanced submarines developed in those years represented a shift in logic as much as in engineering. Earlier boats were, in many ways, surface ships that could temporarily disappear. These newer designs moved closer to the modern submarine, streamlined for underwater endurance, speed, and ambush. Improved hull forms, battery capacity, and snorkel systems pointed toward a future in which the sea would no longer be a barrier or a battlefield alone, but a vast, hidden corridor. To those planning the war, such machines promised strategic surprise. Supply lines could be threatened from below. Larger fleets could be bypassed. Geography itself seemed less stable when unseen vessels could travel quietly beneath it. Yet once again, the promise arrived too late and under impossible conditions. Production delays, resource shortages, and the sheer momentum of a losing war prevented these submarines from changing the outcome their designers imagined. Still, the idea survived. After the surrender, naval powers studied these boats with intense interest. Their influence can be traced into the sleek submarines that later patrolled the oceans during the Cold War, carrying not just torpedoes, but entire doctrines of deterrence and secrecy. What began as wartime improvisation became part of a much larger undersea age. There is something uniquely human in this pattern. We build in order to control uncertainty, and in doing so, we often create new forms of uncertainty for the future. The advanced submarine was not just a weapon of concealment. It was a reminder that progress often moves in silence, below the threshold of public memory, until one day it surfaces as the new normal. What if a wing could be designed not just to fly, but to vanish into the air around it? Seen from above, the aircraft looks almost elemental, less like a machine than a dark fragment of sky. No long tail, no familiar fuselage, no comforting symmetry of the planes people had learned to trust. Just a smooth, swept shape, quiet in silhouette, as if the future had been sketched in charcoal. The flying wing carried with it a strange elegance. It seemed to belong to a later century, one in which flight would become less visible, less noisy, and perhaps less human. The appeal of such a design was not merely aesthetic. Engineers understood that a wing alone could reduce drag, distribute lift more efficiently, and carry fuel or payload in ways conventional aircraft could not. In theory, it promised range, speed, and a different relationship between weight and movement. It also hinted at something more elusive, the possibility that a plane could become harder to detect, less obvious against the sky, less predictable to those watching below. During the war, ideas like this were still fragile, balanced between mathematical insight and manufacturing reality. Materials were limited, testing was dangerous, control systems remained imperfect. Many radical aircraft concepts never had the chance to mature into stable weapons. They existed as prototypes, partial successes, or blueprints waiting for a calmer age. But sometimes the unfinished idea is more influential than the completed machine. It plants itself in the imagination of future designers, who return to it decades later with better tools and different motives. That is part of what makes the flying wing so compelling. It was not simply a lost aircraft concept, it was a glimpse of another path in aviation, one where shape itself became strategy. Long before stealth became a household term, long before computers could tame unstable designs, the outline of that future had already appeared. And perhaps that is the deeper pattern running through this history. Not every invention changes the world when it is born. Some arrive too early, like seeds cast onto frozen ground. They wait beneath the surface of memory until another era is ready to let them rise. What happens when war reaches for the edge of the world and finds only ice, distance, and ambition? Far to the north, where the light can feel thin and the horizon almost unreal, strategy takes on a different scale. In the Arctic, geography itself becomes a weapon and a warning. The cold preserves everything: wreckage, footprints, silence. It was in landscapes like these that military planners began to imagine technologies suited not just for combat, but for survival in conditions that seemed to belong to another planet. Some of the most striking wartime experiments were not glamorous in the ordinary sense. They involved hardened outposts, weather stations, long-range navigation systems, and vehicles adapted for extremes of cold and isolation. These projects rarely inspire the same immediate fascination as rockets or jet fighters, yet they reveal something profound about the era. Modern power was no longer measured only by firepower. It was measured by the ability to operate where almost no one could live, to gather information where almost no one could travel, and to extend control into places nature had long kept at a distance. In one sense, these efforts were practical. Weather data could shape entire campaigns. Arctic routes could alter supply chains, reconnaissance, and future aviation. But there was also a deeper symbolism at work. The farther technology pushed into remote environments, the more it reflected a civilization convinced that no frontier should remain untouched. Ice became a laboratory. Isolation became a proving ground. Many of these undertakings were limited, improvised, or overtaken by the war's end. Yet their legacy traveled well beyond that moment. The knowledge gained in harsh climates would later matter to polar exploration, long-range defense planning, and even the early logic of the space age. To learn how to function in frozen emptiness was, in a way, to rehearse for humanity's next great distances. That may be the lesson hidden in these cold experiments. We often think of invention as a way to conquer the world, but just as often, it begins as an attempt to endure it. And perhaps the most revealing question is not how far a machine can go, but what kind of human longing sends it there in the first place. What if the most audacious weapon of the 20th century was never meant to touch the ground at all? Picture the Earth from far above, blue and silent, turning beneath a sheet of polished light. In the imagination, of a small group of wartime thinkers, space was not only a frontier of wonder, it was a vantage point. A mirror placed in orbit, they believed, might gather sunlight and direct it back toward the planet below, concentrating radiance into heat, glare, and destruction. The idea sounds unreal even now, more like a fever dream than an engineering proposal. But that is precisely what makes it so revealing. This was the logic of the so-called sun gun, not a completed machine, not even a near-term weapon, but a concept that expanded the battlefield beyond atmosphere. It belonged to a moment when the line between science and speculation had become dangerously thin. Rockets were already leaving the ground. Engineers were thinking in terms of trajectories, high altitude, vacuum, assembly, and orbital mechanics. Once the sky ceased to be a limit, it became, in theory, a platform. There is a temptation to dismiss such a scheme as fantasy, and in practical terms, it almost certainly was. The materials, launch capacity, and precision required were far beyond what that era could sustain. But impossibility in one decade often becomes prelude in another. What matters here is not whether such a device could have been built in wartime. It is that serious minds were already asking how power might one day be projected from above, long before satellites became ordinary, and long before humanity had fully understood the moral cost of militarizing every new horizon. In that sense, the sun gun tells us less about a working weapon than about a way of thinking. It reveals a civilization so consumed by domination that even the sun itself could be imagined as an instrument. And it leaves us with a difficult reflection. When human intelligence reaches beyond the world we know, does it carry our wisdom with it, or only our old hungers in a more distant form? What if the distance between continents could be reduced to a single arc of fire? Spread across a drafting table, the drawings look almost serene. Clean lines, measured curves, stages stacked one above the other with the calm confidence of mathematics. But the destination imagined for this machine was not abstract at all. It was a city across an ocean. The A9 and A10 concept, later remembered as the so-called America rocket, carried a chilling implication. War might soon be able to cross the Atlantic not by fleet or bomber, but by sheer velocity. The idea emerged from the same intellectual world that produced the V2, but it reached much farther. This was no battlefield missile. It was a vision of intercontinental strike, a two-stage system meant to lift a winged upper vehicle high above the atmosphere and send it gliding back toward a target thousands of miles away. In theory, it combined rocket power with aerodynamic control. In practice, it lived somewhere between advanced prototype and unrealized threat, shaped by real engineering, but limited by time, industry, and collapse. That ambiguity matters. Some historians see the project as technically bold, yet still too immature to change the war. Others regard it as a genuine foundation for the missile age that followed. What is beyond dispute is the direction of the thinking. The scale had changed. Warfare was no longer being imagined in terms of fronts, borders, or neighboring skies. It was being imagined globally. A nation under siege was still designing machines for a world-spanning reach. And after the war, the concept did not simply disappear. Like so many other ideas born in those years, it was absorbed, studied, and transformed. The language of stages, range, guidance, and re-entry would soon become central to the strategic imagination of the Cold War. What had once existed as a desperate wartime design became part of a larger and more permanent architecture of fear. Perhaps that is the unsettling truth hidden in these drawings. Sometimes the most consequential inventions are not the ones that are finished, but the ones that teach the future what is suddenly possible. What if the battlefield of the future was not only made of machines, but of invisible forces moving through the human mind? By the final years of the war, technology was no longer confined to engines, airframes, or steel hulls. There was growing fascination with subtler forms of power, chemicals that could alter perception, signals that could confuse navigation, devices that might bend the senses before a shot was ever fired. Some of these efforts were grounded in real research. Others drifted toward the speculative edges of science, where fear, ambition, and fragmented evidence blended together. But together, they reveal a shift that feels unmistakably modern. Control was beginning to mean more than physical destruction. In laboratories and testing grounds, scientists explored compounds that affected endurance, pain, alertness, and consciousness. The stated purpose was often efficiency, survival, or tactical advantage. Yet behind those goals was a deeper temptation: to treat the human body and mind as systems that could be adjusted, overridden, or optimized under pressure. It was the same age that produced radical machines, but here the target of experimentation was not distance or speed. It was the limits of the person operating the machine. At the same time, war planners were learning that deception could be engineered with increasing sophistication. Radar could be disrupted, communications could be distorted, information itself could be turned into terrain. This was a quieter revolution, but in many ways a more enduring one. It suggested that victory might belong not only to the side with greater firepower, but to the side most capable of shaping what others perceived as real. That legacy did not end with 1945. In the decades that followed, modern warfare, intelligence work, and psychological operations would expand these principles far beyond anything imagined in those first experiments. The tools changed, the logic remained, and that may be the most haunting development of all. Machines threaten the body in obvious ways, but technologies aimed at attention, judgment, and belief reach somewhere deeper. They force us to ask not only how power is used, but how much of the self can be altered before a person is no longer entirely their own. What if the most enduring secret was not a machine at all, but the way knowledge survives its makers? When the war ended, the laboratories did not simply go dark. Doors were forced open, filing cabinets were emptied, test sites were inspected with a mix of urgency and disbelief. Across Europe, teams moved through tunnels, factories, and research centers, gathering what they could before someone else reached it first. In those hurried searches, technology became a kind of inheritance, stripped of flag and uniform, recast as opportunity. This is where the story turns inward. Until now, we have followed the machines themselves: rockets, jets, submarines, radical aircraft, improbable weapons, experiments at the edge of science. But their afterlife may be even more important than their creation. Once removed from the ideology that produced them, these ideas entered new political systems, new laboratories, new moral frameworks, or perhaps not entirely new. Because the transfer of knowledge is never clean. It carries residue. Names change. Institutions change. The questions remain. The 20th century was shaped in part by these quiet migrations of expertise. Engineers who once served one regime found themselves working for another. Classified reports became foundations for national programs. Wartime breakthroughs were refined into peacetime achievements, then folded again into military strategy. What had begun in secrecy under dictatorship could reappear decades later as the backbone of aerospace research, missile defense, high-altitude flight, or advanced materials science. There is no simple verdict in this. To study an invention is not to endorse the world that made it, and yet to separate discovery from its origin entirely would be another kind of forgetting. History asks more of us than celebration or condemnation alone. It asks for clarity. It asks us to see how human brilliance can be entangled with human failure, and how easily the future can be built from compromised foundations. Maybe that is why these technologies continue to haunt us, not because they were unbeatable, and not because they were mystical, but because they reveal a timeless pattern. Knowledge rarely dies. It changes hands, changes purpose, and waits for the next age to decide what it means. What if the true power of these inventions lies not in what they accomplished, but in what they taught the modern world to imagine? By the middle of the 20th century, the war was over, but its unfinished questions had already entered the bloodstream of the future. Rockets became launch vehicles. Jet designs evolved into the language of modern aviation. Submarines disappeared beneath oceans with a new kind of permanence. Concepts once dismissed as extreme or impractical returned in altered forms, supported by stronger materials, better computation, and a colder, more organized geopolitics. The frontier kept moving, but its emotional logic remained strangely familiar. What had changed most was scale. The old dream of decisive weapons gave way to systems, networks of surveillance, deterrence, communication, propulsion, and control. A single machine no longer had to change the world on its own. It only had to become part of a larger architecture. The dramatic prototypes of wartime laboratories became the ancestors of quieter technologies embedded in everyday life, in airports and satellites, in weather forecasting, navigation, and the hidden infrastructure of national security. This is the paradox that lingers over every chapter of the story. Human beings are capable of extracting usefulness from ruin. We take tools born in violence and redirect them toward exploration, medicine, transport, or scientific understanding. That capacity is real and in some ways deeply hopeful. But hope becomes shallow if it forgets the cost. Every polished achievement has a prehistory. Every elegant technology carries the fingerprints of the age that first demanded it. So perhaps the deepest legacy of these forbidden technologies is not technical at all. It is philosophical. They remind us that the future is never morally neutral at the moment it is conceived. It is shaped by fear, ambition, scarcity, ideology, and the private imaginations of those who believe they can force history to move faster. And maybe that is why these stories still hold us. They are not only about secret projects or lost machines. They are about us, about the ancient human habit of searching for salvation in invention, and the equally ancient danger of forgetting to ask what kind of world that invention is really preparing us to enter. What remains after the machinery is gone? Not only metal, plans, or photographs, but memory itself, uneven, fragile, and forever rearranging the past into stories the living can bear. Walk through any archive devoted to the 20th century, and you will feel it almost immediately. The tension between record and silence. There are boxes filled with diagrams, procurement lists, field reports, fragments of correspondence. There are also absences, missing pages, contradictory testimony, projects referenced only in passing, as if history itself turned its head at the crucial moment. This is where fascination often begins, but it is also where humility should begin. The past is not a machine we can fully disassemble. Some chambers remain closed. That uncertainty has helped give these technologies their peculiar afterlife. They endure not just because of what was built, but because of what was whispered, hidden, exaggerated, or left unresolved. A prototype becomes a legend. A rumor acquires the shape of evidence. A real achievement is wrapped in myth until the two can barely be separated. Yet this does not make the subject trivial. On the contrary, it reveals how modern societies process power. We do not only fear what technology can do, we fear what it may have already done beyond our sight. And so the story broadens beyond one war, one regime, one generation of engineers. It becomes a meditation on secrecy itself. Every age has its sealed rooms, its classified dreams, its confidence that knowledge can be contained until the right moment. But knowledge has a way of leaking into culture. It appears in headlines, novels, films, rumors at family tables, and in the quiet discomfort people feel when invention outruns public understanding. Perhaps that is why these histories continue to matter. They remind us that civilization is shaped not only by what it openly celebrates, but by what it buries and later rediscovers. And as we stand in our own age of accelerating systems and hidden complexity, the question returns with new urgency. When future generations look back on us, which of our inventions will appear as progress and which will seem like warnings we failed to hear? In the end, these stories are not really about lost superweapons, secret laboratories, or machines that arrived ahead of their century. They are about the human condition under pressure. They are about what people dream of when they are frightened, what they justify when they are desperate, and what survives when the noise of ideology falls away and only the evidence remains. Across these chapters, we have seen inventions that blurred the boundary between genius and ruin. Rockets that opened the road to space while first descending on cities as instruments of terror. Jet aircraft that previewed the future of travel even as they rose from the wreckage of war. Submarines, orbital fantasies, radical designs, hidden research, and whispered experiments that together formed a map of ambition at its most brilliant and most compromised. Some were real. Some were embellished. Some remain suspended in uncertainty. But all of them tell us something essential about the age that produced them. They remind us that technology is never just machinery. It is desire given form. It carries the values, fears, and blind spots of its makers. And because of that, no invention can be understood only by what it does. It must also be understood by the world that asked for it, the people who suffered for it, and the generations that inherited it without always knowing the full price. This may be the hardest truth in the entire story. History does not place clean borders around knowledge. It rarely allows us the comfort of pure origins. We build tomorrow out of what yesterday leaves behind, even when those remnants are morally fractured. The task, then, is not to look away from that inheritance, but to face it honestly. Perhaps that is the final lesson of these long-forgotten technologies. The future will always tempt us with speed, mastery, and reach. But the measure of a civilization is not how far it can extend its power. It is whether, in the midst of invention, it can still remember mercy, restraint, and the dignity of human life. If memory has any purpose, it is this: to ensure that what we carry forward is not only knowledge, but wisdom.